Do you think it can make it happen? I feel like it's so hard to make a decision. It feels similar in Dimension Shift in the sense that on its best turns, it feels like it just blows through anything. But what is the fastest its best turns can come? Do you think it has a good chance?
Conjuring Force is a tough one to get into just because I wonder if we're seeing it first, actually. Hopefully. Nope. Wait, yes, we are, actually. Anyway, I feel like every single time I talk smack about this deck's consistency or how convoluted its combos can sometimes be, we then watch it just completely steamroll, so I'm stepping away from it. I think it's actually a really strong deck because it has a very great wealth of strong mechanics in it. It has a lot of things that, like most Runecraft decks, just don't really take advantage of, like Rime Wind allows you to develop a board and get rid of something at the same time. It's a board flip, as Japanese players refer to cards like this. So, it's a deck full of tricks, and I think often underestimating it is like the Achilles heel of a lot of players, which has given the deck a lot of success.
Yeah, I would actually absolutely agree with you. Like, we saw last season Suzzoni bring it. It never really got banned. Suzzoni got through so many rounds with it before people realized it was a good deck. I don't know if you guys play ladder very much, but it's making a good comeback on ladder as well. I see a lot of Conjuring Force there just because D-Shift has gotten a little bit of a nerf, right? It's a little bit slower. Conjuring Force, not slower. It didn't get any slower because it doesn't play cards like D-Shift and things like that. So it still has what you said, like board flips and things like that in Rime Wind. Even Summon Snow, it just gives an added dimension that you don't expect from a rune deck, right? Like, I'm just going to fill the board, turn after turn, you deal with all that. Great, I'm going to play Conjuring Force, play my Blade Mages, combo out my entire hand, go nuts. And it's really hard to stop because you never know when they can combo. So it's not like Roach, where on Roach you're like, okay, turn 7, they've already played a Goblin Mage, they've already played a Fina, whatever it might be, I know what they can possibly do. Against this style of rune deck, you never really know how much damage they can push against you.
Right, for one thing, it's much more of a headache to track the spell boosts on what could or could not be Rime Winds or Summon Snowmen. I think, like, whereas Roach, you kind of want to play around combos by denying them poke damage early on or just developing whatever options of wards you have. Against Rune, it's so tough. You don't know what is vulnerable to Rime Wind. You don't know how many Snowmen you have to clear because how many spells can be played after Conjuring Force. You have to track those spell boosts too. It's a deck you have to make a lot of very tough calls against, and I think like that level of sort of a skill testing gameplay is something that's like probably the most addictive part to watch about the deck.
Yeah, and that's not to say that even though it has all these tricks and all these cool angles of attack, you still have to know to execute it properly. I made mention of this several times last season, that Conjuring Force might be one of, if not the hardest decks to play alongside OTK Roach and things like that. But because the way you win and the way you have to actually go through the early game and the mid game is so abstract at times, it can really make your plays make or break, right? Like every single turn, if you don't order things correctly, like a D-Shift deck, you might fall behind on a specific turn because you didn't account for what they could do. So you have to play all of your cards very well and understand the matchup to actually execute with this deck at a high level.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Whereas, by comparison, sometimes in D-Shift, if you miss a spell boost, that's okay because there's an abundance of spell boosts in that sort of deck. And while it can make or break games sometimes, there are often matchups that D-Shift just excels against anyway. But in this sort of list, that is so non-linear, and I say this because your win conditions could be just flooding through Snowmen and that's it, flooding through Snowmen into Conjuring Force, or Conjuring Force into a Blade Mage combo assisted by Snowmen, then missing a single spell boost on a single card can mean that a turn where you could have won turns into a turn that wasn't good enough. And it is, I think, also worth mentioning, it's a bit of a fragile deck. It doesn't really go in for any sort of defensive options, which is sort of typical of Rune. Though I guess it is also worth mentioning, Essia has added Guardian or Golem Assault to the list, which I think is also another very interesting dimension of the way he's building it.
That's right, and I think that just goes to show how powerful Golem Assault has proven itself to be over the last season. It's just really solid, right? Like, it's a good turn 2 play because it's essentially like drawing a card. You get another spell in your hand. It doesn't effectively do anything the turn you cast the first half of it, but that's fine. Later in the game, it can just win the game by itself, right? You play it for 6 if you have a turn where you can stop, and then now you have all of these 2-cost 3/3 wards, and you just feel super safe into the late game, and then you can use those even to push with a Conjuring Force, or even to protect a Blade Mage the turn before you're going to Conjuring Force just to get some extra poke damage in. You just have a lot of angles to use that card.
Right. Not a lot of classes have a sort of wide-reaching 3 damage AoE. Forest and Shadow, I would say, are two examples of classes that just absolutely don't. People don't really run Foul Tempest or Humpty Dumpty really to deal with things like that. So developing boards with Golem Assault and spell boosting the whole while is just, I think that's really the attraction of the card, is you are able to protect yourself, develop a board that is pretty threatening, that is a lot of damage 3 per for a lot of combo decks that Rune's capable of making. And also, it's like, it's not very frequently outside of Daria that Rune can put down boards that are difficult to deal with, especially when that's not their main goal of how to win games through like board tempo or something like that.
Right. Absolutely right. This is something interesting about this game right here. So OnionSheep has found himself in a place where he has almost the perfect hand, right? He already has a Roach, he already has a Nature's Guidance, and he has the Elven Princess Mage to play this turn, but he doesn't have the hand space to actually put both of the fairies into his hand, so he can't set up his full combo this turn, which is kind of unfortunate. I think that's why he's taking so long to deliberate on what he actually needs to do this turn. What do you think his best course of action right now is?
I was about to say Evolving Goblin Mage.
Yep.
That is because I feel like going second with Forest does have this problem that you've mentioned, is often, because you get an extra draw, and sometimes against a very passive opponent where you want to hold fairies and things like that, you just end up having too much of a hand to be able to risk both milling and not getting full value from Elven Princess Mage. So that only opens up really one separate option of what you can do, and that is get the poke in. Just develop your board, use the Evo points for it if you must. You get the poke in so that you have that much more consistency about finding the lethal approach later.
Right, and the way he chose to develop his board, I think, like you said, was right on point. This puts Essia in a position to where if he takes any more poke damage, if he gets to 14 or less, then he is in high danger of losing to this Roach combo whenever it gets played. So Essia has to not only take care of this board, but also present such a way that he can actually get to lethal at some point. And he has some of the cards to do it, but not everything he needs, because the spell boosting hasn't been as much as he'd like it to be so far.
I mean, his hand already here, going for a Rime Wind is fine, but he takes another 4 damage unless OnionSheep goes in completely for a clear here without sending the Goblin Mage face. But something I noticed is probably one of the more notable weaknesses of this deck is it has a lot of cards that need to be spell boosted, but because it doesn't really have the same inevitability of spell boosting winning the game, he doesn't actually run Magic Owl in the deck. He has reverted back to using Old Levi. So often I think you can find situations like this where you have a full hand that needs to be spell boosted before it can really be developed, but there's not really that many ideal ways to do it. But that said, though, I think developing these Snowmen is very strong. He already has a Angelic Snipe and a 0-cost Fates hand coming up. It definitely looks promising for now.
Yes. The one issue I see is that now OnionSheep was able to develop a board to where he can put these 0-cost fairies in hand. Of course, he doesn't have the second Roach, but Essia is only at 11 now. So if Essia decides to go for an aggressive play here to maybe set up a 2-turn lethal and just forgo this board again, I mean, he can't forgo the entire board because, I mean, there's almost lethal in play already, right? But if he kind of goes half and half and doesn't play fully defensive here, he might just lose the game.
Right. I actually think there's a setup of just on turn 6 playing out the 0-cost fairies that, as you mentioned, he was able to develop thanks to getting his hand out onto the board. Then into 1 fairy, into Roach, Bounce, Roach, and I think that would be 4-6, and the Evo point is... that's it.
That's right. So even so, I think Essia is just out of this game. I don't think he can win in time. Not with all of the poke that OnionSheep managed to muster up. Not drawing those Old Man Levi's early to deal with the board, I think, really hurt Essia in this game. Or anything really that he could play to evolve over into a 4-drop. Like the Snowmen are good, they fill up the board, but of course you can't evo them to kill something as big as a 4/4. So that put him in a really hard spot this game.
If there is any chance of him not quite being out of it yet, he can draw into Golem Assault. Unfortunately, the Fates hand didn't do it. And he needs a leftover of 4 to really be able to play it afterwards, so Kaleidoscopic isn't going to do it. I think that had to be it, really. Because he can clear with... or if he developed Conjuring Force or otherwise, he had ways to clear the board, but already understands that's not going to be how he gets through this, as the OnionSheep already has a very strong development, and he hasn't done any damage left to threaten anything.
Yep, so he will go full defensive here, it looks like, and he will be able to poke some damage in. but I believe you've already done the math, and we know that OnionSheep's going to be able to take this victory next turn.
Thankfully, that was a pretty straightforward roach. It's the ones that come with like the bounce before playing out roaches that I just can never actually eyeball from someone's hand.
Absolutely. So OnionSheep going to do the math in his head. He's like, nah, never mind. I've already done the math. I know what's going on here.
Very, very interesting sort of game to see how that one develops, because I think definitely Essia had a lot of very strong tools in its hand. It just really came down to developing them in a way which is threatening enough to force OnionSheep out of being able to get the perfect hand that he needs and instead have to answer threats. That is, I think, the main challenge that always faces Conjuring Force as a list.
That's right. And honestly, it just came down to that Goblin Mage. That Goblin Mage, A, wasn't dealt with, and B, was able to Evo face and attack twice. That's too much damage too early for Combo Roach to be able to deal for you to actually defend against. And like you said, Essia perfectly read the situation. He knew that even if he cleared the board, he was probably dead. That's why he went for the extra card draw instead of developing the Conjuring Force that turn. And it just, he didn't get there. But I think that was the only wild card matchup there, just the combo deck versus the other combo decks. I think Mid Shadow now has to prove that it can beat these combo decks, and that OnionSheep was, well enough prepared with these bans that he think that is the case.
The only thing that makes me nervous about this matchup is Shadow doesn't really have the same combo inevitability that can just push through all the early game developments of Snowman and otherwise. And also, it doesn't really have anything very powerful in the way of clearing. There's no Foul Tempest or anything like that. The card really hasn't been seen for forever. But any spell that can just one for one for summon Snowman or Rhymewind. Anything that develops on Essia's side of the board, OnionSheep will have to trade into if Essia also has the backup win condition in hand to kind of push it for lethal. So I think that is one of the main ways that we might see Mid Shadow actually struggle against this kind of deck.
That's true. You know what's awesome too? So I've played a lot of Conjuring Force. It's a deck that I made a long time ago. I was very successful with it. One of the main reasons was because a lot of people were playing even the better version of Mid Shadow back when all of the cards were unnerfed and that kind of thing. Rhymewind does a lot of work. Probably the most work of any card against Mid Shadow. Not only do you get to bounce their big tempo play, maybe a Surb evoed into something, or a Dark Blade Fiend, or, your Ceres, whatever it might be, you get to not only bounce that tempo back, not actually have to deal with it, and fill up a board that Shadow can't really deal with. It's one of the biggest tempo pushes against Shadow that you can do that they don't really have a good answer to.
Yeah, I think unless you're playing Havencraft, the ability to deal with bodies without triggering death rattles or providing them value there by doing so is one of the rarest things in the game. A lot of classes just don't have access to it at all. But Rhymewind is one of those rare examples of a very strange card that's hard to fit into other lists, but just offers Rune this really, really powerful potential sort of answer to things like Immortal Thane. In just that strange and situational, but very powerful way that it works.
That's exactly right. As we know, Shadow works around last words. When something dies, an effect happens, and, Shadow builds its deck around getting advantages out of those uses. Rhymewind not only takes that away, but also does all the other things that we already talked about. So it's just crazy. It's crazy. But it looks like this game, Essia actually does have some Levi's here. He does have a Conjuring Force, but he doesn't really have any cards that he's spell boosting at the moment.
And that can make sometimes playing out cards like Magic Missile and Kaleidoscopic Glow that cycle themselves and spell boost kind of tough to use up in the early game. He doesn't really... You can kind of see it on his face that he notices he isn't developing anything here. He's not going in any particular direction. And I think that is the toughest part of playing out a hand like this, is even just having the sort of swing back tempo plays of Levi and the extra damage from Magic Missiles still doesn't progress him anywhere.
So if I'm Essia right now, this is what I'm thinking. I don't have Summon Snow. I don't have a build up to Rhymewind. Right now, all I'm thinking about is I need to draw Blade Mages, and I need to save all of the damage from these Levi's in my hand with a Conjuring Force, because there is no way I'm getting enough chip damage in with my current hand to actually just play this value game turn after turn. Also because I don't have the value cards in Summon Snow and Rhymewind. So this is going to have to be a combo game. This is going to be, I have to clear the board with my Levi's. keep these Crimson Sorceries in my hand and just hope I get Blade Mages in time. If not, I might just fall over.
Right. At the very least, he has found a single copy of Summon Snowman, so that could be one potential thing that knocks him off that course. He still has another Magic Missile left over, and if the time ever comes that he chooses to develop the Levi, like if OnionSheep develops any substantial threats soon, then he has ways to develop board at the very least, and a Conjuring Force to back it up. So, really, I think it just comes down to that split decision of whether Essia finds the Blade Mages and makes the call that he needs to hold the burst on them, or decides to sort of go in with his resources to try to set up something with these snowmen as his win condition.
Absolutely. And OnionSheep just doing, you know, exactly what he needs to do. Just keep filling up the board. He's not even evoing to pressure here. He's saving them in case he needs to be defensive against the snowman. And we like to make the joke that even if you leave one snowman alive, it can be lethal. So saving those evo points, very important, especially if Essia hasn't used any yet. And one of the most important plays I actually want to talk about in this game that we don't see a lot come up, but not playing something to the board that can be evoed into when you're on the draw into your opponent's play on their turn 5, or, you know, vice versa. If you're going into turn 4 as the person on play, maybe you don't want to put anything in play that can really just suck up a lot of value for your opponent's evo, essentially, or give them a lot of value rather.
I think that sort of line of thinking. Yeah, that line of thinking comes up a lot in, like, especially formats like Take-Two, where evolving really becomes one of the most important resources in the game, where Essia's deck runs a limited number of bodies, and losing a resource that either dumps them out or develops them at any time, where OnionSheep might have an easy way to develop over them, could really just be the difference of whether he has a chance to win the game. So, really well described there.
Yeah, and it looks like now OnionSheep just going against that route. He's like, you know what? I see blood. We're going into turn 7. I'm going to start setting up, you know, lethal boards with Magtar because that's what Shadow likes to do. So, deciding to change his game plan here, I can't fault him for that.
I find it really interesting too because I don't think it was a necessary evolve, but it is a very effective one at gathering information. He's noticing how slowly Essia has developed the entire time, and he knows just spending this evolve both nets him the damage and forces Essia to respond to it, so he gets a much bigger read on what Essia has been holding on to this whole time.
And then this happens. This is the scariest thing I've seen. So Essia actually built up a lethal hand. So he kept those Crimson Sorceries like I was talking about. And like you said, the Summon Snowmen, that was the card that he can build his game plan around now, right? Funny enough, he's got the Conjuring Force. He's got 2 Crimson Sorceries. That will spell boost the Fiery Embrace to be able to play it, which will spell boost the Enchanted Sword, which will be able to play, and a Fate's Hand next turn. He's got, like, ridiculous combo damage next turn. So if OnionSheep doesn't clear a lot of this board, he might just die.
It might be actually one of the most comedic clears we'll see in that, well, actually, Ikter can't develop any zombies by himself. I don't see the path to the shadows here, so goes for a Thane instead, which I think is a much more limited range of how much he can clear.
That's right. Does he go for the snowman here? He has to. He has to know to kill these snowmen. You gotta know by now.
I think OnionSheep of all people would not make the mistake to leave them up.
All right, so we talked about 1 snowman. Let's see if 2 snowmen. I'm not going to do the math. I'm going to let Essia wow us with his combo skills here. I'm pretty sure it's lethal, but it might not be.
Okay, so 6 damage face. I'm going to count it out as he does it, perhaps. That boosts down the Fate's Hand to 0 playable range and the Enchanted Sword as well. That's going to be another, or 4 attack on them from that, an extra from the Fiery Embrace. So these 2 are both at 6 and he has an Evo. Wait, no. They're both at 6 and he has an Evo and an Enchanted Sword.
And an Enchanted Sword, yeah. He's got well over lethal here. 20 damage. What's up?
I'm actually kind of speechless at that. Like, I knew that this deck could do things like this, but actually finding 20 damage, exactly even, on turn 7, puts D-Shift to shame.
It does. It puts D-Shift to shame. It's crazy because, like, as you saw in the early games, Essia didn't really have anything going for him. He didn't have his Summon Snows. He didn't have his Rime Winds. But with Golem Assault specifically, because it can protect, As you saw, OnionSheep had to use his Evo just to go over it. He couldn't do other things like clearing out more snowmen that turn. He used it to develop with the summon snow, put enough bodies in play, which was 2, and then just push for lethal with Conjuring Force. Crazy nonsense.
Right.
I love it. That's why Conjuring Force is one of the most fun decks to watch.
Also worth mentioning is I'm actually completely sold on Golem Assault in this deck now as well, because it not only did all of that, but the exact amount of spell boosts that he had developed in his hand was instrumental to actually pulling that lethal off. And that comes also from the double spell boost that is a part of Golem Assault as a card. It's almost like the 3/3 ward is like a magic owl that you don't have to evolve when you have the time to develop it.
Exactly. Double spell boost gets you a 3/3 ward is awesome. I don't leave home without it in pretty much any rune decks right now except for Dirt Rune, but I'm not a fan of Dirt Rune right now. As we see a lot of our players today, much the same. They're playing D-Shift and Conjuring Force, not so much Burn Rune today.
It really is just a day of pure combo and control, which is very interesting to me, because that means we're noticing also it's like there's not really a natural predator for all of the combo decks around here, because we have yet to really see a control deck rise up that has the capability of kind of pressuring them out of the early game consistently. But this is kind of like one of those matchups that might show us that kind of game where Mid Shadow can kind of play on the control-ish end of things. It can play for value, but a lot comes down to how much of a threat it can put on early when it wants to try to survive against combo decks, as we saw last game. OnionSheep did his best. He even evoed kind of to force things out of Essia's hand, but lacked the ability, the way a control deck might be able to actually kind of clear and safeguard himself out of it.
That's right. And this is funny, but like this is a metagame shift that I feel like if you actually just did bring the triple aggro lineup right now and you piloted it very well, I think you could just clean this bracket up. This bracket is so slow. So slow. And the only aggro decks that we even see present are Vengeance Blood decks, which again, not the greatest versus aggro decks. They can be, but not always.
I'm also noticing it's a little unfortunate. Essia's hand is pretty tough to actually work with around here. But yeah, I did actually want to respond to that. I feel like the sheer amount of special teching that we've seen against control, really, I think that's like teching versus control is, I think, like the theme we're noticing across a lot of the decks today. But things like Meow's way he built Shadow, even Essia's Conjuring Force, these are decks that would just get completely eaten up by fast enough game plans. And I wouldn't really count Vengeance as a sort of aggro-leaning game plan, rather than it does all of its burst throughout like turns 6 onward, I think.
Right. And it's a deck that has to play very precariously against aggro because they can just spike you, right? Like you can't really ever play Belphegor and play into your Vengeance Blood plan. But Vengeance Blood is one of the better aggro decks or mid-rangey decks versus control, because you can Belphegor on turn 4 pretty easily and not worry about it. What's funny, though, is the one combo/control deck that is bad against is OTK Roach, which we see in very high numbers today. So I'm very interested to see why these Vengeance Blood players did bring that deck today. And I'm sure we'll get to that when we do some of the interviews today.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm thinking kind of like what players had in mind, what they were kind of teching against, is like we see that in much more full force today than we usually see in even in round robin, when players are either bringing what they like to play, or like, okay, my opponent's playing these archetypes, I'll play the scissors to the paper and things like that.
Right. Exactly. Today it's comfort, and like one of the things that I will say about aggro in a tournament setting like this, aggro is a type of game plan that's easy to read, right? It's straightforward. You know exactly what an aggro deck's trying to do. It's trying to play out the most aggressive line it can to try to end the game as quickly as it can. Now, the problem with aggro decks in a format like this is if you're playing against all good players and they all have mid-range and control decks, you might just fall flat on your face, even if it's just one round, which could be enough to knock you down, which then, you know, you get into the loser's bracket, then you have to play even more games, and then you just have one more opportunity to lose, and then you're knocked out, right? So aggro decks can just fall flat. Even if you're playing super well, they just don't give you a lot of options. Once you run out of cards, you're done. And if you didn't kill your opponent, they're just going to take over the game and win. And I think that's why a lot of players in these types of events shy away from aggro, because it limits their options, essentially. It limits what they can do in the games. So
yeah, I think that's actually the most accurate insight that could really be said of aggro as an archetype. It wants to win games before the games are played, and if it fails to do so, well, that is to say, if its original plan of defeating its opponent before their opponent has had a chance to develop in the game at all fails. It's like the one archetype that can't really come back into a lost game at all. As opposed to control decks will always have more threats that they can develop or ways to clear bad board positions, or a combo deck always just simply has the chance to find its combo.
So if you guys were wondering why we don't see aggro today, that's probably one of the biggest reasons. I think people are just afraid to play it against good players in a setting where they have to win all of their matches, right? Like this is for all the marbles today. This is who's going to solidify who's going to the finals and who's going to win next week. So you don't want to take any chances. Well, I say these players don't want to take any chances of just losing out games to aggro deck, matchups that they couldn't really do anything about.
We could probably make the prediction even that aggro probably won't be seen in the coming week either, when things only get more tense. But I mean, already seeing how much these players prepared to face against the archetypes they're expecting, I think when the 3 winners have sort of been selected from each regional, that's when we'll see some truly interesting deck choices.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see if something like, we knew it was going to be like a Fatina versus Akamar Red finals again, something like that. If somebody just pulled an audible, like Akamar Red just like, I'm playing like it ends at 5 sword and aggro forest and things like that, decks we don't normally see from him, and he's just like, you know what, Fatina, your combo decks, your control decks, not today.
I might have actually made a wrong call then, because like bringing aggro into just like that much shorter number of games against fewer people, forcing someone to have to tech against it when there's a third player in the room who could be playing whatever,
that's true.
I think
that's true.
Yeah.
The third player adds the wild card there. If it was just 2 players, I think you could actually tech just like we've seen in the round robin. But with that wild card, yeah, it could spell doom. So maybe we won't see that. Now I'm less excited. Not really, but.
Returning to the game here, I'm noticing pretty slow openers from both sides, which is what made it so easy to talk of archetypes and such. I think we noticed I noticed a bit on Essia's kind of expression about his opening hand and every draw he had. He doesn't really have any development here. He's a Roach deck who, well, he's managed to get 1 Roach. He's managed to get Tina out, but he hasn't had any development of 0 costs. He has no good times to use his Cassiopeias. So outside of having the combo, he's having trouble finding the poke or other tools that make it easier to use Roaches for that plan.
So he decided to pass his turn 6 instead of playing an Aaron, instead of playing anything in his hand. A Cassiopeia, even just to put something on the board and maybe pop the Chimera so he couldn't Soul Convert it / Demon Eater it. Just decided to pass there. What do you think about that play?
I imagine these players understand that the one time you get to play slow versus Shadow is that window between 1 and 6, where they don't really have any powerfully developed threats, just sticky followers, and that's it. So I think Essia didn't want to give up any hand size, which might fuel Cassiopeia's ability to turn it now, or he didn't want to throw away Aaron because he only has 1 Evo point left and no way to recover it, and he might need it for the lethal swing later with Roach.
Okay, I feel that. And now he's actually got a perfect play. He can Angelic Snipe into Cassiopeia, clear this entire board. Feels good.
And that really just comes from passing. If he developed Aaron there, then he would have had a threat that was able to trade in for a little bit, or forced OnionSheep to use one of the many tools of removal that's characteristic of Shadow. But passing there didn't really end up paying much of his life total, and just gives him a perfect swing turn.
The one interesting thing about not developing the Aaron, though, is now I really feel like Essia might just be playing into Shadow's game plan, right? So, like, you play the Cassiopeia, it's great, you clear the board, it's going into turn 7, where Zombie Party, as we see 2 of an OnionSheep's hand, just takes the tempo right back. It's essentially the same play, right? Except it develops 3 2/2s instead of a singular 3/3 body. So not having the Aaron on the previous turn in my mind means he missed out on possibly some chip damage, or possibly just baiting one of these Evos out of OnionSheep so they doesn't have as much power going into the late game to actually finish the game off. So I'm not sure about the turn 6 play. It's not the worst thing, you know what I mean? But I feel like it could have given him a little bit more stretch going into this late game. It's still not going to be a bad play next turn. Not by any means. He's going to get his Evo point back, and it's going to be good. But I think OnionSheep is firmly ahead right now.
Yeah, it's definitely beyond doubt that OnionSheep has a much better position. I think it was a pretty reasonable play, but it's unfortunate that the options that he opened up by passing that turn aren't really the most attractive in the world. He can develop his Aaron and get that evolve for free now, meaning he did save the point, but it does mean he ended up losing board by a pretty huge margin, and it plays directly into Soul Squasher, of which OnionSheep has 2 and is halfway through his deck, so there's no way he doesn't have it at this point.
Right. So it's going to be interesting. Essia's plays have to be very, I want to say they have to be perfect every turn from here on out because of the value OnionSheep has in his hand. He already has the Ektars. He already has another zombie party. He has Soul Squashers to deal with, even an extra Evo that Essia might have. He's got Soul Conversion to redraw. He's got 2 Evo points left that he can even use with Andriolphus to just steam through the rest of his deck if he wants to. I doubt that's going to be the case, but he has that option. So I think everything's in OnionSheep's favor now, and if Essia makes one mistake here, one wrong turn, I think it's going to be lights out.
That is possible. I'm actually, although I hear all of that, trying to read how much damage Essia actually has coming up, because he drew that Elven Princess Mage specifically. The Elven Princess Mage puts 2 0 costs into his hand, and then his hand is already developed. He has a Bounce, Angelic Snipe, and 3 0 cost cards he can develop.
And an Angelic Snipe, which I really like seeing back in OTK Roach again.
Ooh.
Oh, it looks like he's gonna Pixie Mischief to do a little tempo play here. Okay. That means he doesn't have a bounce for combo now, though.
I guess to read it off, whether or not that actually develops anything, Angelic Snipe sets to 17. The 3 0 cost cards make it so that he has 2 roaches in hand, which would then deal 5/6. Yeah, unless he has another bounce, I think that did toss the combo away. But I've noticed there's this kind of trend of just maybe perhaps using up a combo piece in order to try to play around potential lethals or really difficult threats that could be really tough to recover from, assuming their next top deck doesn't really help them very much, is something I've seen happen a lot. And while we have perfect information to sort of call what's the best development and what isn't, it can be very tough for Essia to kind of like make a call like that.
Absolutely. However, I do think that OnionSheep made a misstep this turn. I think that Ektar was the best play. Put Essia into this 2-turn lethal type of situation. Now he's just giving Essia more time. If his thought was maybe he just has lethal next turn anyway, and you don't have a ward regardless, unless you played like a Thane with a soul conversion that turn, I think you just have to push enough for lethal. I don't like the strategy that OnionSheep went with that turn. It's giving Essia time here.
I agree. It afforded a lot of actual tempo gain to the Elven Princess Mage there, rather than it could have just been quite easily dealt with. Did have an Evo to expend for that purpose.
Yeah, didn't even need to use the Evo though, right? Just Ektar, play it down, clear out the Elven Princess Mage, have an entirely full board -1 slot. Didn't have the Skull Beast to fill up the board, but still, and pushing that much damage means the second Ektar comes down and becomes lethal. And now he's just without a board again.
We've seen both players kind of stumble into a pretty...
Wow! Had 21 shadows also. So I'll let you recover for a second. For those of you who don't know, Deathly Tyrant, 6 play point 3/3. If you have 20 shadows, it has Storm also. If you have 20 shadows, it consumes them to give it +10/+10. So that was lethal drawn and discarded because OnionSheep had a full hand. Wow.
I am completely speechless, actually. There was never a more perfect Deathly Tyrant draw in the history of Shadowverse. 13
That's
health.
true.
Exactly, or just right over 20 shadows. And I think there were ways to develop that hand that OnionSheep perhaps might have not considered top decking into it. I mean, it could be so hard to really plan around that, didn't know it was coming. But there were ways, I believe, to play that turnout that would have dodged really having a shot at milling the next card.
Overdrawing. So let's actually talk about the strategy now. So if OnionSheep didn't go with the Ektar plan, maybe he's just like, you know what, I can really end the game with Deathly Tyrant whenever I want to. That being said, if you don't play in such a way where you force yourself to not overdraw, so you're just drawing normally, then I think you're playing against your own mindset, right? Like you're like, I need to draw this Deathly Tyrant. I'm building up these 20 shadows to do so, but I'm also filling up my hand, which means I'm going to overdraw. And then we see this situation where he draws the perfect card and he just can't put it into his hand. Oh my god.
There is also always the possibility that he wasn't really counting on Essia to have another Cassiopeia, perhaps. Well, he's 13 cards into his deck and found quite a few of them already. I think that's is that the third one, actually? I believe so.
I think it is.
But, you know, any number of things really could have cleared it in that way. It probably just was a simple misstep to make. But, kind of following the line of how you were describing how OnionSheep's game is going now, I feel like he's reverted at this point through those series of plays back into having to grind this. As in, he has to develop a fully resolved board and swing with Ether, which is a really tough thing at this point, I think, as any single top deck for Essia of a bounce or otherwise could just simply spell out a very clean 10 play point lethal.
Right, and I think because of the way OnionSheep played, I said that Essia was going to have to be the one that didn't make a mistake every single turn because I thought the line was clear for OnionSheep. Not that he's playing poorly or anything like that. I just feel like he's playing a little slow in a matchup where he can't really afford to play slow. The more turns you give Forest, the more chances you have to lose. Now, developing this board, after saying that, he does have a big ward that has to be fought through, so he's not technically out of it by any means. Plus, he's setting up a huge board that will clean up with now Serb. He's got a Death's Breath for next turn, Ektar. So, if Essia doesn't draw something here, he might just be locked out of this game. Yeah.
Yeah. Elven Princess Mage doesn't help. Another Ictor in hand, and no real further development of how to clear this. The only choice we see here is Crystalia Aaron, and if he were to play around another Ictor, that would take up his next Roach. Or he could toss, I don't know, doesn't have a second Angelic Sniper or anything like that. Oof.
Let's see, so how much damage do we have with Ektar right now? We have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So it's not lethal. So Essia did the math. He knows he can't be killed this turn, so he still has an opportunity to draw another card. Again, he does have an Angelic Snipe, and he does have 3 0 costs in his hand. So 18 damage is not anything to snap at, but like we said, he has the Death's Breath, and I think that's lights out for Essia.
Right. Nothing in Forest is really going to help clear that. I think Essia had a line earlier. I feel like his hand and his total like game position went from like really threatening and really dangerous to really unfortunate when he lost that one bounce that was in his hand.
Right. I think the Pixie Mischief play might have cost him the game.
Essia takes the loss, and right, you mentioned it right there at the end. Pixie Mischief is, and when you're running bounces, right, you have access now to Nature's Guidance, Airbound Barrage, and Pixie Mischief. Now, given Pixie Mischief is a little more expensive.